with those coronavirus bailout numbers appearing to soar to astronomical heights, it seemed like the perfect time to talk to our friend and leading economist, Stephanie Kelton, who is a professor at the State University of New York and the author of the forthcoming book, The Deficit Myth. Stephanie Kelton, as you may know, is a leading proponent of what is known as modern monetary theory, or MMT. We'll talk a little bit about that and how that definitely seems to come into play in the current situation. Without any further ado, Stephanie Kelton, thank you for coming back on the Zero Hour.
Yeah, you're welcome, and it's good to be with you, Richard.
So listen, first of all, so we've endured what seems to me to be decades of austerity thinking of one kind or another. So just as a global context, we don't have the budget for this, we don't have the budget for that. We've been told for how many years that we can't afford to maintain the Social Security system at its current levels, much less expand it, on and on and on. You know the whole list better than I do. All of a sudden, corporate America finds itself in enormous trouble, and there seems to be no dollar figure too big to be thrown on the table. We're talking about half a trillion dollar rescue package for corporations, plus this, 4.5 trillion in potential loans from the Federal Reserve. Is everybody suddenly, have we created something called corporate modern monetary theory?
I mean, I definitely understand why you want to look at it that way. As you said, we're looking at maybe 4 trillion in support coming from the Federal Reserve, half a trillion at least. And let's be honest, this is only the first. Really, it's the third phase, but there will be more money made available. And but there is also some money in this $2 trillion bill that came out of the Senate yesterday that will get into the hands of small businesses and working people and other struggling families and so forth. Now, you're right. The lion's share of the total dollar figure, which many of your listeners may have heard, something more like 6.5 trillion, is aimed at supporting companies, especially very large companies. So are we somehow able to conjure up trillions of dollars to support major industries and large corporations at a moment's notice after spending years and years talking about how we can afford to do things like make public colleges and universities tuition free, cancel student loan debt, move to a Medicare for all system, and on and on? Yes, we are. Yes, we are. We are demonstrating for the American people that when Congress is prepared to act, it can always pass legislation and authorize spending, even massive increases in spending, without having to stop and worry about this whole "where will we find the money and how are we going to pay for it" question that's so dogged us for years and years.
So, I don't know if I got it from you or someone else, but the Labour politician in Great Britain, Anthony Wedgwood Benn, said, no general ever said, I want to bomb Baghdad, but I don't have the budget for it. Now we're seeing a Congress will never say, I want to bail out Boeing or whomever, but I don't have the budget for it. So several things flow out of this, but one of them for me seems to be, what's the long-term implication here? I mean, as I understand MMT, which is not much, but as I understand it, one of the big constraints is inflationary, right? So are we is Congress rather just generating so much money in order to save corporate America, and I would say be a little stingy on the worker side, but are they generating so much money that there's going to be some sort of inflationary crisis coming down the road?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, we definitely have a couple of things going on, one of which is that lots of businesses are being told that they have to remain closed right now. And so there's a sense in which there's what economists would refer to as a supply shock. You can't produce, your restaurant can't open, your bar can't open, your barber shop can't open, and the list goes on, your massage parlor, your gym, right? So we are cutting supply in the sense that we're not allowing tens and thousands and millions of companies to manufacture and produce the things that they were producing just a month ago. But what I think we're hoping to do is we're not flattening the curve. This is hopefully something that we're going to get through in a period of months. It may be 6, it may be 8, it may be 12. We need to contain the spread of the virus and develop a vaccine, and we'll come out of this on the other side. But in the interim, what we really need to do is to allow people to survive. So people have recurring expenses. If your employer tells you you can't come to work and I can't pay you, that's a problem. So one of the things Congress is trying to do is to make sure that some income continues to flow to people, even when they're cut off from payroll. They got to pay the rent or the mortgage. They may have a car payment, a student loan payment. They got an electric bill, a cable bill, a phone bill. There are recurring expenses. So when we think about an inflation risk associated with all of this spending, the question is really, are people just in receiving income and then handing it back over to the landlord, to the auto dealer, to the bank, and paying those recurring expenses? And if that's what's mostly happening, and I think it is, you're not going to see inflationary pressures as a result of that. I mean, we got oil prices way down right now. Energy costs are down. So when we think of inflation, you think, what are the main drivers of inflation? It's really housing, healthcare, and energy. So if you were going to see inflation start to pick up and spiral out of control, you'd be looking for housing costs to spike. You can't even buy and sell a home right now. You can't even have an appraisal. You can't even show up a property, right? So energy costs are down. So I'm not worried in this environment about the risks of inflation associated with all of this spending. I think most of it is just people trying to cobble together enough income to hang on through this shelter in place directive and just pay the bills.
Again, we're talking with Professor Stephanie Kelton, author of the forthcoming book, The Deficit Myth. The other thing that occurs to me, Stephanie, in my understanding of the thinking behind MMT, is that it appears to me that what has dominated our political economy for a long time has been a situation where we have the resources to do many things we need to do, but we've created for ourselves constraints in the form of perceived budgetary limits. So you have this situation of artificial fiscal constraints as opposed to resource availability. It seems to me that what we're facing now are severe resource constraints at it, this inverted that we have these resource constraints. People can't work, so human resources are a tiny fraction of what they were. So many other supply chains and so on. So we have resource constraints at a time that Congress is basically saying, we'll print as much money as you want. So how does that look through an MMT lens?
Oh, okay, well, let me say this. I think that Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez made a really important had a really important insight. She made a comment the other night at one of these virtual town halls that she did with Senator Sanders. And she's talking about the fact that Congress is very quickly committed to spending $2 trillion in this Senate bill. That the Senate is passed this thing and we can come up with a couple of $1 trillion. And what she said is that it's teaching us an important lesson because it's showing that we always had the capacity to do this, not just because we're confronted with a pandemic, but that we could have done something similar if we had wanted to make public colleges and universities tuition free, if we had wanted to cancel medical debt, $81 billion of medical debt for people who had it. We could have done these things, and we could have done it the same way that we're doing the legislation today. So that's about financial resources. What she's saying is we can always come up with the money. Congress can always come up with the money to fund its priorities. But as you said, the real constraint, the relevant constraint, are the real resources. So Congress can write a bill and commit to spending lots of money to help states build field hospitals, buy ventilators, purchase PPEs for frontline healthcare workers, and on and on and on. Hire doctors, pay doctors, pay nurses. But if you don't have the ventilators, if you haven't produced the masks, if you don't have doctors and nurses trained and ready to come in, then what you have is a real resource problem. All the money in the world won't help you get those things until they have been produced. So yes, the essential point that MMT always makes is that the federal government of the United States, as the issuer of our currency, as the issuer of the dollar, can never run short of money. It can always afford to buy whatever is for sale in its own currency. The problem we have today is, well, many, but one of them is that those things aren't currently for sale. They need to be produced. And so we need to do what we did, in the mobilization for World War II. We need mass production of the real resources that we need to take on this fight. The money can always be there.
So, and that money being, not to sound like I'm back in college or something, an abstraction of sorts, one of the things that it strikes me about the current conversation is the glib way that a lot of people in government and corporate leaders are talking about potentially sacrificing human life in order to, quote unquote, get the economy moving. And I'm sure you've seen the same comments I have from former Wells Fargo executives, Goldman Sachs executives, and so on, basically saying, yeah, so we'll lose a few people, but we got to get back to work. Now, where does, if at all, does MMT fit into that, in the sense that these are people operating, it seems to me, in a finite financial universe, and they're basically saying, we're willing to kill off a few of you to make sure we don't lose too much of this finite source of money. Does MMT have anything to say about that, or?
Well, look, there are certain things that we could do that we're not really doing that would prevent, let's say, the spike in unemployment that we saw today, right? Jobless claims of 3.3 million today. So are there things that we could do to provide a protective shield for the economy as we continue to do this social distancing and to ask people to stay in place? Look, I think that when governors are giving directives to their population, to the businesses in their communities, and saying, you may not open, you cannot open your doors to customers, when you're telling non-essential workers to shelter in place, you're essentially giving them, you're redefining their job description. Their job now is to stay home. And the reason you need people to stay home is that it helps save lives. So this idea that we have to choose between protecting jobs and doing right by the economy or saving lives is just a false choice. We can and should do both. We know that it's important to slow the transmission, to keep people separated right now, out of the workplace unless they're essential. But we've got to provide the economic support mechanisms that allow us to redefine a person's job. Right now, your job is to stay home. And we're compensating you for doing your job because that helps to save lives. So what we should be doing, I believe, is finding ways to keep people attached to their employers, keep them on the job, keep them on payroll, but keep them temporarily out of the workplace. And so that, in a sense, allows you to get to a situation where you don't have this explosion of unemployment that you're then going to have to come along and clean up on the other side. But you can also continue to save lives.
So, final question for you, Stephanie Crowton, which is, you mentioned Representative Ocasio-Cortez saying, this teaches us, this shows us. A lot of people are saying, it's illustrating that we've been operating along artificial boundary lines and perceptions and so on. But I also recall after the 2008 financial crisis, a lot of people were saying they'd learned their lesson. Alan Greenspan, everybody else was saying, we can't go on. And it seems that we reverted back after that to the old way of thinking. So what are your thoughts either about the possibility that this could in fact lead to a new understanding of the economy, and or what it would take to increase the likelihood that it leads to a new understanding of the economy?
I don't know, Richard. It's such a huge question,
Right.
and yeah, no, I mean it's an important question, but trying to figure out ahead of time whether we're going to learn the right lessons and use this in a sense as an opportunity to recognize all of the vulnerabilities that have been exposed. Many of us, you and I, knew that these vulnerabilities were there, that with our trade policies, with our social safety net, fraying and not being strong enough to support a downturn, to support people in an economic downturn, that our healthcare system had, vulnerabilities, leaving 87 million people under or unemployed. And we're going to have a whole lot more without health insurance very soon, because you lose your job and your health insurance is tied to your job. Well, there you go. You got a lot more people now without health insurance and without jobs. So are we going to learn a different lesson this time? Are we going to put Band-Aids on and try to just get through this and come out on the other side with more or less the same kind of economy that we had going into it? Or are we going to use this as an opportunity to strengthen the social safety net, to recognize that there are vulnerabilities in our supply chain, that we should have built in redundancies so that we weren't dependent upon the rest of the world for critical medical equipment and face masks and all those sorts of things, right? What about our healthcare system? Are we going to fix that, or are we just going to deal with this short term and then again come out and rely on private health insurers and employer-sponsored health insurance? So, I think maybe one of the things we're going to learn is that you can go into a crisis with trillion-dollar deficits and large public debt, and that isn't an impediment to Congress being able to act, that the Fed can manage interest rates down, that we can run bigger and bigger budget deficits without the sort of fallout that mainstream economics has taught for a long time. Interest rates aren't going to spiral out of control. Inflation's not going to go wild. We're not going to default on our debt. So we may learn some of those lessons, but I think maybe even more importantly, we should be learning how critical it is to redesign our economy in ways that protect and safeguard people in moments of crisis. So I hope that's the lesson we learn.